Croeso, hello and welcome to Blueprint Cymru, a podcast bringing ideas, experience and ambition to the conversation of building a better future for Wales. My name is Simon Hobson. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Gareth Evans. Gareth is a lecturer in law at Swansea University, where he specialises in constitutional law, devolution, and how power is distributed across the United Kingdom. His research focuses on the Welsh devolution settlement, including Senedd reform and debate around devolving the Crown estate to Cymru, and he's written on the history of Welsh Liberal MPs at Westminster and how the UK's territorial constitution was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Gareth's interests also extend to constitutional law in relation to the system in Canada. And so perhaps through his lens, he can bring a little more light and clarity to the concept of federalism within the United Kingdom. Today, we're going to be digging into law, power, and where the real limits of Welsh self-government lie. It's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast, Gareth, so welcome.
Thanks very much for having me. Thank you.
So perhaps we could start by maybe you telling the listener a little bit about your childhood, schooling, and I'm always quite interested to know how Welsh language and culture has influenced your journey through life up to where you are now, and as an academic.
Yeah, so I grew up in northeast Wales. Grew up there and went to school, and sort of have connections with family all across North Wales. Welsh language is a fairly big part of my family. I have Welsh speakers and sort of a few first language Welsh speakers within my family. I myself, I'm not first language and would not describe myself as a fluent Welsh speaker, but have sort of an intermediate knowledge of the Welsh language. And Welsh sort of affairs and Welsh culture play sort of a big part in sort of me personally as well. I went to university in Aberystwyth, where I studied law and then stayed to do a PhD in law, looking mainly at the territorial constitution in relation to Wales. After that, I did lecturing for about 18 months at a university in England, and then I came back to Wales in March 2020 and started the job at Swansea. So been here for roughly 6 years now. So yeah, made a fairly good tour around Wales in my time and then sort of in my childhood work and university study.
I was just wondering, was that important to you that you did study a university within Wales?
Yeah, it was. I did apply to universities in England and Wales, but sort of I'd had quite a few family members had gone to Aberystwyth, and that was sort of an important part for me to almost like keep the family legacy going in a way, and a few had studied law at Aberystwyth. And yeah, I also wanted to study aspects of, in particular, Welsh politics and Welsh constitutional law, and thought it was a better place to do that at a university, and also kind of wanted to stay relatively close to North Wales as well, which is why I went to Aberystwyth as opposed to a university in South Wales. So yeah, it was important to me to stay and to sort of be educated within sort of the broader understanding of Welsh current affairs and Welsh politics. Yeah.
And so what was it that specifically drew you to, well, one, law and then constitutional law that as it applies to Wales then?
Oh, longer story to that really. I've always been interested in sort of how states sort of, I used to love looking at maps when I was a kid. So like studying lines on a map was always like a thing that I used to do a lot of when I was sort of growing up. I used to have a world reference atlas that was like my favorite book at the time, and understanding how states operate. And then at A level, I did government and politics and sort of first encountered devolution as an academic topic, and became fascinated by it, and then went to university. Wanted to do law, did initially think I would practice law because a few members of my family practice law, but got sort of totally engrossed in the academic side of it, and in particular the constitutional side of it. and stayed on and did a dissertation at undergraduate looking at should Wales have a independent legal jurisdiction, should Wales have a legal jurisdiction separate from England, and then stayed on for a PhD looking at sort of the broader theory about theories of sovereignty within the territorial constitution and the role of nationalism within that all as well. So yeah, sort of initial interest sparked at A-level and was able to pursue that through university, and yeah, haven't really looked back on the academic side of things now really as well.
Yeah, so some very big subjects there. So I guess we could start off by looking at the constitution as it does or doesn't exist. The UK famously doesn't have a written constitution, and I'm speaking to you from Quebec, where Canada and Quebec, which we might get into talking about a bit later as well, has a written constitution and works on different legal systems. So from a Welsh perspective, is the fact that the United Kingdom doesn't have a written constitution a weakness, or is it a feature that Wales can benefit from in some way?
To some extent, I think you can look at it from both angles really. The UK constitution, in being unwritten or uncodified or lacking entrenchment, whichever sort of way we look at it, that affords a degree of flexibility, which makes constitutional change slightly easier or slightly quicker to take place. So that's why devolution was able to be enacted initially by ordinary legislation. We have the Government of Wales Act in Wales, which has been amended again by ordinary legislation, like the Wales Acts in 2014 and 2017. So it allows for a faster pace of constitutional change, and it doesn't require, if we compare it to Canada, a formal amendment procedure within sort of the territorial constitution. So to some extent affords advantages of flexibility, but on the other hand, the lack of legal recourse or the limited recourse to a written constitution means that there are distinct vulnerabilities within the territorial constitution when things maybe aren't working out quite as they should or as desired. We saw this during Brexit, when the devolved administrations were quite vulnerable. When Westminster wanted to do something, they had limited legal recourse to actually challenge that.
Well, we've got the Internal Markets Act, which the Boris Johnson government brought in, and I mean, as to my understanding, that certainly limits what the devolved governments can do as far as innovating their economies and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And the method of that was being passed. It was passed by Westminster, which a defining feature in our territorial constitution and our constitution more broadly is the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament, which means that they can, in law, override the devolved legislatures. Now, there's theoretical questions there about to what extent would they be able to override that power. But in law, at least, there is that power of override, separate from a formal federal system like Canada, where there is more of an explicit division between what is a federal matter and what is a provincial matter.
And how unusual, and we're sort of using the example of Canada, both because I live within it and you've studied it and understand it. But how unusual is the United Kingdom in 2026 and not having a codified constitutional system that the Senedd could reference to and push back to Westminster and say, well, you can't do that, or Westminster equally could say the same to the Senedd?
Yeah, we are quite unique in the sense that we're, well, on the one hand, not a federation, so we are a devolved system, but the lack of having a formal codified document, we are an outlier. There's only a handful of states around the world that don't have a formal codified constitution. So yeah, we're an outlier there, and also in terms of territorial governance, we're a relative outlier in terms of the fact that there is quite a strong degree of double asymmetry in that the powers between the devolved institutions are different, but also there's the lack of legislative devolution within England. There is not an English parliament or regional parliaments within England with legislative powers. So we're an outlier in a few perspectives, really, in terms of entrenchment and in terms of the actual nature and layout of the territorial constitution as well.
So, because it's quite interesting, because when I have conversations, because I'm personally interested in this subject, so I have broader conversations with friends and family and so forth, and those within New Wales, the organisation. It's quite interesting that United Kingdom feels like it's sort of working as a federal state without having designed a system to fit that. So perhaps you could speak a little bit to that and how we've come to that place, really.
Yeah, I think we to some extent you can look at it from a pre and post 2016 perspective. In that sort of pre 2016, there was quite a lot written about the UK becoming a quasi-federal or a federal-like state in terms of the nature of its territorial constitution. Post 2016, which mainly after the Brexit vote and the related factors with that, there's been more of an assertion of the final legislative authority of the UK Parliament. So we've seen in a few cases, courts have started by stating that the UK is a unitary state, in law at least. And some of the dynamics and interpretations about potentially entertaining the idea of the UK on a journey towards federalism started to contract a little bit during the Brexit period. So yeah, we're in the position now where we exhibit certain characteristics of a federal state in terms of there are devolved institutions with strong degrees of what we define as self-rule, so strong powers to make their own laws. But historically as well in the UK, we've had fairly limited shared rule mechanisms, so intergovernmental relations mechanisms between the devolved institutions in Westminster. They've been quite weak historically. They have been reformed in the last few years and they are changing. But they sort of, again, within that federalising dynamic, we sort of have quite strong self-rule or autonomous units. But the mechanisms where they talk to each other are not as well developed as you might find within a formal federal structure.
Yeah, and I think, obviously that's causing a lot of heartache for all concerned, isn't it? That lack of formal channels and how it's more or less down to the Prime Minister in Westminster whether they wish to speak to First Ministers in other nations. Certainly seems, from my personal perspective, to be a weakness to the structure. I'd quite like to explore a little bit about your knowledge on the Crown Estate, and obviously within Wales, this is a very hot topic, and it's I've probably got to a crescendo, shall we say, as far as the politics of it is concerned. But what, in your view, is the legal justification for the Crown Estate not being devolved to the Senedd?
The fundamental legal justification is that it's for Westminster to decide. That's sort of where the fundamental idea is, that Westminster can decide as to whether or not it devolves or not devolve the Crown Estate. The justifications, mainly political, for why it's not devolved is matters of complexity. Sort of dividing the estate would cause unnecessary complexity within the governance of the Crown Estate. And also there's recently been justification that it would interfere with some of the pipeline of renewable energy projects that are being negotiated within the Crown Estate licence system, particularly offshore energy projects. So Westminster have sort of shown a general reluctance to devolve and opposition to devolution, and there's been a general preference for it from mainly led by Plaid Cymru. There's a bill before the UK Parliament at the moment about the devolution of the Crown Estate, led by Plaid. That's passed through the House of Lords. It's now in the House of Commons. And also Welsh Labour as well have voiced their preference, and local authorities in Wales. So a little bit of a political standoff really between Westminster and institutions in Wales, or parties in Wales, about devolution.
And sort of a question that pops into my head around the actual word devolution. I don't know if there's a legal definition of that or a position on it. But if you think of something devolving, it sort of has quite a retrograde, at least in my head, negative context, when actually what we're talking about is empowering nations within the United Kingdom to run themselves and make their own decisions, bringing democracy closer to people. So is there a legal reason as to why devolution is used within the United Kingdom as a term?
Not necessarily explicit legal reason, but the explanation or the sort of definition of it within the literature is that the word devolution denotes the transfer of power from a higher authority, namely Westminster, to a subordinate authority. So there's a degree of hierarchy within it. If we compare that, it's different to a federal system where there's explicit division of competence between the centre and the states or the regions, and they're seen on more of a horizontal basis. There's more of a hierarchical relationship in devolution, which is a vertical transfer of power down from Westminster to the Senedd and the Scottish Parliament and the Northern Ireland Assembly.
And I leads me into thinking about, obviously on the 7th of May this year, there's going to be an election for a new Senedd. Mm-hmm. That whomever takes over as government, it looks like it's going to be a different political setup as far as parties are concerned. I wonder, is there a way that political leadership within the Senedd, if they have a deeper understanding of devolution and devolutionary law, how that knowledge might help them think more creatively around alternative ways of delivering in building the institutions that Wales needs within the current limitations? Have you got any thoughts on that?
I think you kind of touched on it really. There is an interrelationship to some extent between different areas of competence. We often talk about devolution within certain specific subjects. So the devolution of broadcasting or the devolution of the police, we sort of talk about them in isolation, whereas the actual reality is that to exercise competence in one area, you sometimes step into another area, at least partially, to see that. So an understanding of that overlap, and to some extent that's been flagged up by recent constitutional commissions in that certain areas of competence that the Senedd currently holds, for example, its powers over net zero, it does require some other levers, or it would be beneficial for it to have certain other levers devolved to it, be those policy levers or be those financial levers, in order to be able to fully utilize those powers. So within the scope of the powers already existing, it is to some extent being fairly creative with what you've got, but also recognizing that there is some demand or some recommendation for the further devolution of powers in certain areas to help better inform policy areas which the Senedd already holds competence over.
And you mentioned it there, along with the Crown Estates, obviously the other area that there's a lot of conversation around and more or less universal political agreement on within Wales is the devolution of the policing from Westminster to the Senedd. And again, my question to you is, well, what are the legal reasons for not doing that when Northern Ireland and Scotland already has those powers?
Yeah, this is a longer running sort of demand. Yeah. It's been sort of some of the current debates about that devolution of the Crown Estate have only really evolved fully in the last few years, or they've only really gained prominence, whereas the policing and justice debate has been going on for quite a number of years now. In terms of legally, it is possible to devolve it. There is no legal reason why you can't devolve policing and justice. The only real sort of factor that informs that is that it's up for Westminster to decide when and if it devolves it. Politically, the reasons are not massively dissimilar to the opposition to the devolution of the Crown Estate. It's that aspects of finance, aspect of the extent to which it would be beneficial, or would it cause additional complexity. But also the policing one is linked up to the devolution of the justice system, or the creation of a separate Welsh legal jurisdiction. Some academics and practitioners say that you can devolve one without the other. Others say that to devolve policing, you also need for there to be a distinctive Welsh justice system separate from England and Wales as it currently operates. So it is a more complex, or it's a much broader issue compared to certain other areas like broadcasting or the Crown Estate, which are fairly identifiable, isolated areas of competence. This has got a few sort of a lot more of a joined up relationship with other areas of competence. So it's an ongoing debate. It's currently opposed. There's been some recommendations for partial devolution of policing and justice, but at present there's not been a massive amount of movement on those. So it's an ongoing debate, and one which is likely to continue, I think, after the next round of Senedd elections.
And I had a follow-up question to that, which you sort of partly answered there, which was about having to have a separate, pulling the legal structures apart so that Wales could come out of the England and Wales label as far as law was concerned. And you sort of suggested already that it would be necessary to take those steps in order to get the most out of policing and justice within Wales. But is that something that, because we see in Northern Ireland, obviously there's a lot of political history around policing there, and partly one of the reasons why Irish Revolution happened and so forth, and then Scotland has a bit more history of retaining those powers and that legal structure. So do you think, I guess this is a personal view as well as a legal view on your part, a lot of this is down to just the length of time that Wales has been imbued into the English structures?
I think to some extent, yeah, there is more to unpack in the Welsh sense, in that Wales has the England and Wales legal jurisdiction has its origins in the mid 16th century. So it's existed for a long time, and the laws there was a famous piece of legislation in the mid 18th century that applied all laws that reference to England also extended to Wales. So Wales's legal history has been very closely linked to England compared to Scotland and Ireland, and as is ratified Northern Ireland. In terms of that, there is a lot more to unpack, and there is a lot more of a less of a distinctive legal identity within Wales. Post-devolution, that's evolved. There is now a body of Welsh law which is recognised under the Government of Wales Act. But one of the arguments about not devolving justice in Wales is that still a lot of Welsh legislation comes from Westminster. A lot of it is still included in UK Acts of Parliament that apply to Wales. Now this will change over time, but that time will take time. The Senedd doesn't pass a massive amount of primary legislation every year. So to some extent it is unpicking that, but also that's not necessarily to say that just because of that reason you can't devolve justice. You can just devolve it and interpret that legislation within a Welsh system of courts. So there's more history to unpack. Scotland, if we compare it with Scotland, retained its own independent legal system at its Act of Union in 1707. So Wales is different in its constitutional history and its legal history, which means that there is more to sort of unpack in that, but also that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be done. So it's sort of a middle ground within that all, I think. Yeah.
And I see myself as a Welsh Liberal, so I'm particularly interested in the research and writing you've done on Welsh Liberals in Westminster in the 19th and 20th centuries, and wondered if you had something you could share with the listener about what they were trying to achieve constitutionally, and did they see themselves as trying to reform the UK or reshaping Wales's place within the United Kingdom, as it were?
To some extent, there was different perspectives depending on the members that you look at. So sort of the Liberal ascendancy in Wales starts at the election in 1868. And that's when you have a series of fairly individual and radical MPs, but they're only, you could count them on one hand really, but they're very passionate about Welsh interests, and they pursue debates like they start the disestablishment of the church in Wales debates. They start debates about Welsh educational reform, about tithes, but they pursue it on a fairly individual basis, and they want recognition of Wales at Westminster and Welsh legislation. And then after 1886, you get sort of a new group of Welsh Liberals being returned, which goes on to include David Lloyd George, Tom Ellis, fairly radical characters who start to have slightly different ideas of not just creating Welsh legislation at Westminster, but also creating some form of distinctive Welsh representative body. And it's that they were talking about a Welsh council at the time. Often their proposals weren't for an elected body; it was for an appointed body of representatives of the local authorities in Wales. So it wasn't massively dissimilar from sort of the design of a advanced tier of regional government within Wales. So these sort of evolve over time. And then you have another group of Welsh MPs who are seeking for distinctive Welsh processes at Westminster. They're seeking for a Welsh Grand Committee to discuss Welsh legislation at Westminster. They're putting forward a raft of bills that deal with just Welsh issues. So they approach it from two sides. And there's a degree in the research I've done of broad cooperation with Scottish Liberals at the same time. So they were particularly the more radical MPs who were demanding devolved assemblies, or what we may term now the embryonic forms of devolved assemblies. There was a lot of cooperation between Scottish and Welsh MPs in the 1890s, both putting forward motions for a Scottish assembly and a Welsh assembly. So they start to cooperate a lot together. So you can sort of see that there's this rise of Welsh issues, which is quite important to stress in Wales, that Wales was starting from a position at this time where there was no distinctive Welsh legislation, or very, very little. Welsh members weren't really defined by their national identity, or at least back in 1868. So they were really pushing, although we see it now as relatively minor sort of movements, at the time these were relatively radical reforms in the recognition of Wales at Westminster, and Wales within broader processes in the UK state, eventually leading up to demands for some form of body within Wales to make either primary or secondary law in relation to Wales. Yeah.
And you might disagree with this statement, but why do you think that Welsh radical liberal with the small L tradition, well, and with the capital L, why do you think that seems to have dissipated or largely gone? Because you mentioned 1860s being sort of the catalyst moment in history where that really sort of people came together to forward those ideas. But if we go back even further to the 1760s, there was a lot of Welsh small L liberal radical ideas being put forth, in some of those pamphlets and thinkers heavily influenced, for example, the founding fathers in the United States of America. And yet today, and maybe this is me being a skeptical modern viewer, there doesn't seem to be that sort of radicalism and fresh thinking, energetic ideas of that liberal tradition coming out of Wales.
I think the Liberals themselves, I think the decline of Welsh liberalism is partly attached to numerous factors: the ascendancy of the Labour Party in the early 20th century, but also the Liberal Party achieved a lot of what it wanted to achieve. A lot of the issues which they attached to distinctively Welsh issues, like disestablishment, they'd achieved by the 1920s. So to some extent, I think that was a declining factor for Welsh liberalism as well as the ascendancy of the Labour movement. And a lot of those ideas, particularly constitutional ideas, migrate across to what becomes Plaid Cymru, and informs that sort of thinking, with sort of ideas of not absolute independence, but sort of fairly unique sometimes framing of Welsh autonomy, or demands for Welsh autonomy, which was quite distinctive. Plaid historically was not a party that went for outright independence. It had a variegated set of different ideas about Welsh freedom, about sort of different demands for Welsh autonomy within the British Empire, and then in a post-imperial context, Wales within Europe. So I think they've sort of been reboxed to some extent, and they've moved across, and maybe not be defined now as associated with the Liberal Party, or not sort of clearly associated. But there is sort of a lineage, I think, of that evolving into other parties, and also within the Labour group there is ideas of recent demands for radical federalism within the UK from the Welsh Labour group. I think there's still sort of a germ of that overarching tradition is still there. It just might not be associated with one particular group or set of individuals, as it was in sort of the latter part of the 19th century, mainly with the Welsh Liberals.
And thank you. With you bringing up Plaid Cymru there, something popped into my head with, see, Plaid's been around for 100 years now, and yeah, and as you said, it's evolved, and it's got different, or has historically had different factions that wanted to lean more or less towards full independence for Wales. And obviously, as I reiterated before, I'm speaking from Quebec, and Quebec's got that independentist tradition. And the Parti Québécois here, there's provincial elections in October here, and it looks like they're going to take a majority and become the leading party, with First Minister from Parti Québécois. But I was, and that individual is promising to have a third referendum on sovereignty for Quebec. And one of the questions that I get asked a lot by individuals here in Quebec when I talk about Wales and Welsh politics with them, and how Wales sits legally within the United Kingdom. Well, first off is Wales. I didn't know they existed. Explain more. Where is it on the map? And after I've done that, they ask about parties and similar parties to Parti Québécois, and I talk about Plaid Cymru, and they say, well, that's been around for 100 years. How come Wales isn't independent yet? We've had 2 referendums, and Parti Québécois was set up in the 60s, and that was born out of an individual, largely René Lévesque, who was a Liberal MP in Quebec. So I guess, are there legal reasons why things are so much slower, or is it just a characteristic of the United Kingdom, or a characteristic of Welsh culture and people, maybe?
In terms of why Wales hasn't had an independence referendum?
Yeah, really, because it seems like it's got so many of the ingredients to make up the complete recipe for a nation that should be, if not out and out for independence, certainly be having some serious conversations about it. And it seems like it's very much, you have to be very brave to talk about it unless you're in Plaid Cymru. So I just wondered, and that's largely a question, as I say, galvanized by conversations I have here with people in Quebec.
I think one of the main reasons that Wales hasn't sort of entered that territory of having or talking seriously about having an independence referendum is the overarching political makeup of Wales up until now, at least, has been majoritively unionist, or parties who are in favour of devolution but don't really have a strong or sort of explicit idea about independence. Then the only party, as you mentioned, that clearly campaigns for that is Plaid Cymru. And Plaid has historically been confined to Yfrog Gymraeg, like West Wales, Welsh-speaking West Wales, and has, as we've seen in Caerphilly, now started to move outside of that. But it's never really had a majority in the Senedd, similar to the SNP, which led to the independence referendum there. So to some extent, the political strength has not been there to actually demand an independence referendum. If that should happen after the Senedd election, which it looks in the current polling like Plaid are on course to sort of be the largest party, if not the main party of government. There is legal precedent from Scotland that if an independence referendum was put in place, and Plaid have said that they would not call an independence referendum in their first term, but if they were to seek one, holding one would require, through we've seen through the precedent in Scotland, the consent of Westminster. So it would involve an agreement about the question and about various factors around the arithmetic around the election. So I think it's something which could happen in Wales. It just hasn't happened because there hasn't been a clear enough sort of general support for independence or support attached to parties which are campaigning for independence within Welsh elections or UK elections from Wales.
I'm probably straying towards more of your personal views here, and so if you don't want to engage with this, and that's quite understandable. But I've always thought that it should be, the conversation should be equal, and one of the reasons why those of us that founded New Wales came together was we felt that there wasn't a rounded enough conversation that's sort of questioning the status quo or breaking away from the status quo. And it's not necessarily to take a party political or an independentist or a unionist position on something. It's just, well, people need to be informed and people need to have that genuine knowledge in order to make those decisions themselves. And it strikes me personally that there's very little time given over by union supporting parties for making the case for the union in the 21st century. The pressure seems to be on what they term as nationalist groups to make the case for why they shouldn't be part of the United Kingdom. But really, if we're in a voluntary union, which is always, if that's legally the position, then surely, like the European Union made the case to the United Kingdom before it left, there are reasons why there's a benefit for Wales being part of the United Kingdom. So again, as I say, I caveat with this, you might not want to make comment on this, but do you have a view as to why that conversation isn't being had by unionists?
I think that if we look at Scotland, the unionist voice in Scotland became strongest in the immediate weeks and months before the referendum vote, when the polls started to look like that the independence campaign was making significant ground. And that there is a broad party political point about it all, but I think that to some extent the emphasis is on the groups that wish to change the current constitutional arrangements. That the emphasis has been on those to state why they wish to change that, and as you've said, less of an emphasis has been on explaining or justifying the status quo, or on a broader scale, explaining the unionist arguments. I think going forward, we're probably going to see, with the new Senedd election system and the new sort of increasingly more multi-party system that we're going to have in Wales, there's going to be a variety of different perspectives on independence, some of which will be for outright independence, some of which will be for more graduated forms, and some parties will be fairly in favour of the status quo. So I think that there's going to probably be more discussion about constitutional matters as we go forward. I think the constitutional question it's never really had the same level of salience in Wales compared to Scotland. There's never been a big enough demand for independence within Wales to bring it within maybe the mainstream media as much as it has been in Scotland. But that may change after May if there's a broader sort of explicit vote in favour of parties that say that they wish to seek independence in the future. So I think it's one which historically, for reasons of public attitudes, probably hasn't been at the forefront, but which is likely to change after May if we base it on the current polling and the nature of potentially having parties in a majority in the Senedd in favour of independence in one form or another.
And as we come to sort of close on the conversation, I always ask people where they see Wales economically, politically, culturally, constitutionally, all or one of those things. Where do you think Wales will be in the next 15 years? Where will it arrive? Good
question. And I think a lot of that will depend on the political makeup of the Senedd, and it will depend on the political makeup of Westminster as well. And I think we need to be aware of both. That even if there is a strong majority for an independence party in Wales, if there is a different political makeup at Westminster, that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a vote on independence. So, going forward, it depends a lot on sort of the broader politics. I think there are some things which are probably going to change. There's within the Senedd reform legislation, there are requirements to revisit certain parts of it. So to have a look at the boundaries again for that. So it's we're going to probably have a slightly different makeup of the Senedd's arrangements about constituencies. We may have a change of electoral system again to STV, which is what some of the parties favour. And if there are, based on the precedent in Scotland, parties in Wales which are more outspoken in favour of seeking Welsh autonomy and extending to Welsh independence, we may get a transfer of powers from Westminster in other areas like justice, like policing, like the Crown Estate. But it all, to some extent, depends, I think, on the will of the parties, on the strength of their vote, and on the broader politics in Wales and Westminster over the next few years.
Thank you. And what yourself academically, have you books that you're writing or anything, events, things?
No books at the moment. No, I've got a few papers about Senedd reform. So one of which is looking at sort of the historic arguments in favour of devolution up until 1998. So that's going to be hopefully coming out soon. And a paper about the Crown Estate and about environmental law matters about that. So yeah, a few projects on the go, but not a book yet. But hopefully in the next 3 years, hopefully.
Great. Gareth Evans, diolch yn fawr. Thank you for being today's guest.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Diolch. Thanks.
If you enjoyed this conversation, have comments on today's topic, or would like to be a guest on the next episode of Blueprint Cymru, head over to the New Wales website where you can get in touch and donate to support our work. The address is a very easy one. It's just new.wales.